Hey Oakland family, glad you are tuning in with us this evening for a midweek devotional. Tonight we're going to be in Psalm chapter 56, and so as we're, as usual, rolling through a few announcements, I'd ask that you'd get your Bibles, your notes, all that good stuff open as long as you're able to do so. But just real quick, want to give out a reminder that this coming Sunday, September the 26th, we will have a Brown Bag members meeting immediately following the morning services. That will be the way that it usually is. After the morning services conclude, we'll ask that you'd go grab you to-go lunch from somewhere, or you're welcome to bring your own if you'd like, and then meet us in the fellowship hall area of the CLC, and we will conduct some church business and certainly get you out of there in a timely manner. I've also been asked to, I always feel strange doing this, being a pastor with October Pastor Appreciation coming up, but I have been specifically asked by Aunt Carolyn to make sure that I spread the word to remind everyone about Pastor Appreciation. Aunt Carolyn is going to be setting up baskets in the foyer starting that first Sunday in October, and it will run the entire month of October. And if you have any details, or if you need any further details, please see her. But that's my shameless spreading the word of Pastor Appreciation Month. But we are so grateful to our church family, and though certainly it's always nice to be even more appreciated, we feel appreciated throughout the entirety of the year, much less than just 1 month. So we are certainly thankful for our church family. But with all that said and out of the way, we're going to be digging into Psalm 56. Psalm 56 is a psalm of David, as many psalms are, and we've already kind of looked a little bit about, or looked into a little bit of background about David's life. And I've said before, if you don't know David's story well, or if your knowledge of David is really just David and Goliath, David and Bathsheba, and David as king, if that's kind of your only three major points on David, I'd encourage you to go back to 1 Samuel, read about David's life, read about some of the struggles that he had, some of the turmoils, the obstacles, the blessings. Read about King David's life, because certainly as part of the lineage of Christ, he is an important character in our Christian faith, but also knowing more about David's life and his circumstances absolutely helps us to better understand the Psalms, since many of them are written by David, or they're maskils of David, or they're laments of David, or as Psalm 51 was, it was a repentant prayer of David. And so we see over and over and over again that David plays a huge part in the Psalms. And so the more background and storyline that you have in David's life, I think the better that you can apply these Psalms and understand these Psalms in which they were written. And so Psalm 56 is a song of trust ascribed to the time of David's visit to Gath. It specifically tells us that this psalm is set to the tune of a dove on distant oaks. David asserted that even though his enemies waited to destroy him, he trusted confidently that God, who knew his sufferings, would deliver him. His confidence led him to anticipate praising God for deliverance from his danger. And so we see that in this particular account, David has sought asylum in Gath. Remember, we talked a few weeks ago how at this point in life, David is fleeing from King Saul. David and Jonathan are very good friends. That's King Saul's son, Jonathan, and David are very good friends. And we see that King Saul began to become increasingly jealous of David and his recognition. Remember, there's that scene where David and King Saul both are kind of coming back into the city after being off at war, and they began to chant, Saul has killed his hundreds, David's his thousands. And that's kind of where that green-eyed monster of jealousy begins to set in King Saul's life, and it progresses from there quite extremely up until he tries to take David's life, I think at least 2 different times, by literally throwing a spear at him. David's playing his harp as he normally does, and King Saul thinks to himself, what if I pin him with this spear up against the wall? And so he throws and misses, and it kind of progresses from there, and David flees a few times, and we have this instance where David flees into this dark cave. King Saul and his men are looking for David. They get wind that that's where he's at. And King Saul comes into the cave, and David is able to be so close to him without him knowing that he cuts a little piece off of his robe, and then he presents it to King Saul later, and he says, I could have killed you had I chose to, but I didn't. I spared your life. And so we just have this unique story that Psalms gives us, or that 1 Samuel gives us insight to as we're reading the Psalms. Because again, the more that we understand David's story, the more that we can better understand why he has written these particular Psalms. And in this instance, we have David who has been on the run, and he's now fleeing King Saul yet again, and he has fled to the city or the region of Gath, which again is where the Philistines reside. And so quite a unique set of circumstances. Remember, David and Goliath, the one who killed Goliath the Philistine, has now fled to Gath because he feels that he could be safer in a enemy territory than he would be in his own territory because of King Saul. And so just a unique set of circumstances here. So let's dig into this particular psalm and just follow with me as I read. Be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me. All day long an attacker oppresses me. My enemies trample on me all day long, for many attack me proudly. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you, in God whose word I praise. In God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? All day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They stir up strife, they lurk, they watch my steps as they have waited for my life. For their crime will they escape. In wrath cast down the peoples, O God. You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. In God whose word I praise, in the Lord whose word I praise. In God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? I must perform my vows to you, O God. I will render thank offerings to you, for you have delivered my soul from death. Yes, my feet from failing, that I may walk before God in the light of life. Not a particularly long psalm, but there are some important things that I want to point out and take away from this psalm. In the first 7 verses, we see that there are enemies that are conspiring against King David. In a previous psalm, we talked about David has fled to a particular region, and the rulers of that region actually went to King Saul and said, hey, we're pretty sure David's in our region. What would you give us for him? And so fast forward, and now we have another instance where David has yet fled again, and he has more enemies that are conspiring against him. And so David begins to pray that the Lord would destroy those who conspired to kill him. Verses 1 and 2 include his introductory cry, be merciful to me, O God, be gracious to me, O God. He says that proud slanderers are hotly pursuing him all day long. The ESV translates, it's all day long, an attacker oppresses me. My enemies trample on me all day long, for many attack me proudly. But because David's confidence was in God, whose word he praised, he realizes that he need not fear mere humans. When he says in verse 3 and then in verse 4, he says, when I'm afraid, I put my trust in you, you meaning God the Father. In God whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? That could also be translated, what can mere man do to me? And in fact, some translations do translate it that way. And that gives us a good picture of David fully understands that his confidence and trust is in God. And while his confidence and trust is in God, there is nothing that man can do to him. Now, let me give you a caveat there. I'm not necessarily saying that David did not know at this time that God would deliver him. He fully believed God would. He trusted that God would. But I would also believe that David understood that even if God chose not to, even if God did not deliver David from those circumstances, David knows that he's serving God and that he is fulfilling God's will for his life. And so David, you almost, certainly he's got these obstacles to overcome. Certainly he prays to be delivered, as would any of us. But I also think David understands the balance between when serving God, things are not always going to be the way that we want them to be. In order to serve God's purpose, we have to surrender our desires for our own will, for our own goals, to make sure that our wills and our goals align with God the Father. And so certainly David understands that, and again, let me make clear, David's not saying that just because he put his faith and trust in God that man can't touch him. That's not true. We saw in multiple occasions where in David's life he's been injured. He's been again the whole instance with David and Bathsheba. I mean, we see that there are times that he is fallen prey and he is at the mercy of man. But what David means here is that ultimately, eternally, what can mere man do to him since he has placed his faith, trust, and love in God? And that alone is a fitting application for us just out of the first 4 verses. And that's something that should have been pretty clear and evident as we were reading, that as we as Christians, as children of God, as members of His family, we certainly put our trust and faith in the fact that Christ came to this earth, lived a perfect life, died on the cross for us so that one day we can stand before God with eternal judgment right in front of us and be counted as righteous, not because of our own works, but because of what Christ did for us on the cross. And when we understand that, we can also say, what can mere man do to me? My salvation, my eternity is secured in God the Father through Christ's sacrifice on the cross. And so David understands that his faith, his trust, I mean, look at how many times he says, when I'm afraid, I put my trust in you. And then he says, in God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. And what you ought to do is take your, I'm using an Apple Pencil, but take whatever it is that you use to take notes or your highlighter or whatever, and every time that you see that in God, I put my trust in you, in God, God I trust, and he's going to repeat, over and over and over again. He says, verse 9, God is for me. Verse 10, in God, whose word I praise. Verse 11, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. Over and over and over again, he reiterates this phrase because certainly it's strengthening for David. As David is giving praise to God, as he is repeating the phrase, in God I trust, in God whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. You got to understand that there's comfort and strength in that as David is repeatedly proclaiming those words to God the Father, as he is repeatedly bowing his knee and saying, in God who I trust, that will deliver me. In God whom I trust, I shall not be afraid. In God whom I trust, what can man do to me? And we would all be wise to take David's approach in our circumstances, in our obstacles in life, that we would repeatedly bow on our knees and say, in God whom I trust, I shall not be afraid. In God whom I trust, I know He will deliver. Because I can promise you this, if you stay faithful to God, God will stay faithful to you. And the benefit of that is that even sometimes when we're unfaithful, God is still faithful to keep His promises to His children. And so then we move on. Verse 3 and 4, he says, what can flesh do to me? Verse 5, he says, all day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They stir up strife, they lurk, they watch my steps as they have waited for my life. For their crime will they escape. In wrath cast down the peoples, O God. And here David is confident again in God's deliverance. And so again, the psalmist has laid his problem before the Lord and begins to pray that God would destroy his enemies, that God would deliver him from his current circumstance. And David essentially says, the problem is that my enemies are continually twisting my words. They're plotting to destroy me. They're dogging my steps. We get this imagery, this kind of mental picture that David has no rest from his enemies. I mean, can you imagine that? Can you imagine David is already fleeing from King Saul, whose son is one of his best friends, and certainly David and Saul would have been close companions. And now Saul is jealous of David, and so David is fleeing, and everywhere that he goes, it seems that people are still pursuing him, whether it's Saul's men, whether it's men in Gath, whether it's men in other towns that just want the reward for David. I mean, everywhere that David goes, he meets an enemy, not just wanting to, not just speaking ill of him, not just disagreeing with him, but wanting to kill him, wanting to capture him. And so everywhere David goes, he is experiencing this turmoil. And so we kind of get this imagery, this picture here in 5 through 7 of his enemies that just will not stop. They are persistent. And yet, David kind of reminds himself and reminds us as we're reading that even though he's got enemies that are conspiring against him, even though he's got enemies that are continually dogging his steps, enemies that seem to never go away, even though that's true in David's life, he still places his faith, trust, and hope in God. And he knows that when he does that, that God is for him. And so let's look at what he says in verses 8 through 13. You have kept count of my tossings, put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. In God whose word I praise, in the Lord whose word I praise. In God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? Notice the similarity there in verses 3 and 4 and in those verses 10 and 11. They're very similar, and certainly when the Bible repeats things, we ought to pay attention. And it is no accident that the thing that David chooses to repeat here is the fact that he trusts in God and he will not be afraid, that he trusts in God and he does not fear the flesh. He trusts in God who he knows will deliver him. 12, he says, I must perform my vows to you, O God. I will render thank offerings to you. For you have delivered my soul from death, yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life. And so there in verse 12, we see that admission of David, or in verse 13, we see David's his own admission that God has already delivered his soul from death. Essentially, I read that and understand that David is saying that no matter what happens in these certain circumstances, I know that my soul has been delivered from death. Now again, certainly David is praying that he would be delivered physically from this circumstance, but David also has this sort of peace about him as he knows that God has delivered his soul from death. Notice the tense of that sentence. It's not a future tense. It's not even a present tense. It's past tense. David knows that God has delivered him. So we see that David reiterates his confidence that the Lord knows about his suffering and will protect him. He's confident because God knew him intimately, even recording his tears. You see that verse in 8 and 9 where David says, you've put my tears in your bottle. Some translations call it a wineskin, as we see oftentimes, even in the New Testament, Jesus uses some parables and some sayings, and he talks about wineskins. It's that same sort of imagery there. But David says that you know me so well that you've kept count of my tossings, that you've put my tears in a wineskin, in a bottle. You've kept up with me. You know me intimately. It means that God does not forget his suffering. Specifically, he knows that, I kind of, in verse 8, when he says, you've kept count of my tossings, this is not the literal translation of this, but I kind of get this image in my head. You know when something's really bothering you, and then you try to go to sleep at night, and you're just constantly tossing and turning, and you can't get comfortable, and when you think that you are, you begin to worry, and you begin to stress, and you begin to be anxious about whatever it is that's around you, that's trying, or the obstacle that you're trying to overcome. That's kind of the picture here that I have of David speaking to God. David says, God, you've kept count of how many times I toss and turn in bed over being pursued so hotly by my enemies. You've kept in a wineskin my tears. You intimately know the sufferings that I have. You intimately know the problems that are before me. And David finds comfort in that. David finds extreme comfort in knowing that not just that God hears him, but that God intimately knows all of the intricacies of what he's facing, even to the point that he's kept count of how many times David is tossed around in bed trying to overcome this, how many times David has cried, and God essentially has gathered his tears and put them in a bottle and says, I know, I see your suffering, I'm here. And again, that's a little bit of a loose translation, but that's the imagery that David here is trying to portray, that God intimately knows and that God is there in the suffering with him. He knows that God is for him, and he can say that in full confidence. As should we as Christians. We can, with full confidence, declare and proclaim that God is for us. And then in 10 and 11, the psalmist David rewords the refrain from verse 4. The fact that he trusts in God's word. He knows that mortal man is powerless to thwart God. And then in 12 through 13, David's confidence led him to anticipate that God would deliver him from danger so that he might live. He says in the bottom part of 13, that I may walk before God in the light of life. Obediently before God is David going to walk. And we see this in other Psalms as well, but David is so confident that God would deliver him that he writes this in the past tense of, you have delivered me. And so that's why preceding those verses, he says, I must perform my vows to you, O God. I will render thank offerings to you, because David is so confident that God is going to deliver him. Is that the kind of confidence that we have in God? How often in our trying times, in our circumstances, how many times when you've got a child that you don't know what to do with, when you've got finances that you don't know how you're going to make ends meet, when you've got family members that are sick and in the hospital, when you've got marriages that are falling apart, how often in our times of distress, how often in our times of deep and darkest need, do we still praise and proclaim the fact that God is in control and that we confidently place our trust in Him? Sometimes it's easy for us to kind of have I think sometimes as Christians we have this shallow sense of when things go bad, we turn to God. You know, when things go bad, all of a sudden you start maybe praying a little bit more. All of a sudden you start reading your Bible a little bit more. All of a sudden you start going to church, because we kind of have this human mentality where we think it kind of averages out. And that's not the kind of mentality that David has here. David's mentality of being in distress, he doesn't just turn to God in kind of a shallow sense of, I'm going to start praying more, I'm going to read my Bible a little bit more than I was before. No, David just goes deeper. David goes deeper and he says, God, I'm so confident that you will deliver me. I'm so confident. I place all of my trust and my hope in you. And the thing about David is that we see David does this in the good times and the bad. And so certainly the challenge for us today is that in these trying circumstances, even in the times that we're living in, where Christians are constantly bombarded by the ways of the world, how do we respond to that? Will you continually say that you are so confident that God is in control? Are you so confident of your faith, hope, and love being in Jesus Christ, in God the Father, that you're willing to say, nothing of the flesh can thwart the plans of God? Because that's exactly what David says here. In David's circumstances, in his trying times, he still continually admits and repeats that it is in God whom his trust lies. Can we say the same in our lives, in our everyday lives, in everything that we do? Can we truly say that God has our whole hearts, that God has our whole life, that we are willing to serve Him and praise Him in the good times and the bad? Guys, we love you so much. We will see you Sunday morning, good Lord willing. Sunday school begins at 9:30-ish, and the main worship service begins at 10:30. So certainly if you feel comfortable with that, we would love to see you there. And guys, if there's ever a way that we can pray for you better or serve you better, don't hesitate to let us know. We love you guys so much. God bless.